may I request Professor Kamar, F. Kamar, to give us a kind of a talk in order to let us know more, to appreciate, and to we are all Samit Pani. We are like students who shall be sitting before you and listening. Yes, sir, you are most welcome, sir. Please begin.
Thank you, Professor Chidananda Bhattacharya ji, for speaking such nice words. In fact, this morning has been a very, very enlightening morning, I believe, for all the participants. It was music to ears to listen to Yogendra Yadav, and of course he speaks from his scholarship, from his experience as psephologist, and also presently as a direct activist in the field. So I am sandwiched between the two doyens, Yogendra Yadav ji on the one hand, and Professor Desai on the other hand. I congratulate you, Professor Debrat Das, for taking this initiative and somehow thinking that I could be one of those people who should speak on this seminar. I had come to Rabindra Bharati in 2018 for your convocation, and at that time I had the pleasure of spending some very, very fruitful time with Dr. Debrat Das. He showed me around, we engaged in conversation on a wide-ranging issues, and true to the traditions of Bengal, he was not only quite informed, but also it was quite stimulating and enlightening to listen to him and to learn from him, although he is much younger than me. And now 3 years later, it was a pleasant surprise, Debrat, that you considered me for this program to speak on dissent and democracy, a critical perspective, being organized by the Rabindra Bharati University Teachers Association. And as Yogendra Yadav said, that this, in the current context, is a very, very courageous initiative, and you deserve all the congratulations and praises, not only you, but all the colleagues in your Teachers Association who supported the idea. I also congratulate you for being at the helms of the affair of the Rabindra Bharati University Teachers Association. And I'm sure that the university is in a very, very good and safe hand, with you all being so alert about what needs to be done. Interestingly, let me share that to help me recall the time that I had spent with Professor Debrat Das, he telegrammed me a group photograph in which he was sitting on extreme left and myself on the extreme right, of course with 2 other people in the center, one a little left to the center and the other a little right to the center. Debrat tagged the photo as me on the left, of course with a smiley. He had simply stated a material fact, but by implication, I read it metaphorically to mean as if myself was on the right. And in the spirit of moment, I replied that as far as I am concerned, I am on the side of the truth. Being a novice to the language of new media, I sent the message without suffixing it with a smiley or any other appropriate emoji. It was just a pun, Debrat, but from your next message, I thought that perhaps it caused you some anguish. So please pardon me, my apologies to you if it caused you some distress. It was just a pun and not intended in any way. However, what I had stated in my reply tells about myself. So far, I have been unable to align myself to any specific ideology left, right, or center, or to any groupings of any kinds. Because I always found that the moment you take a position and you belong to a group, you are bound by the main ideas of that grouping, and somehow your reading, writing, and your lectures is centered around that. While what I do is that in most of my speeches and writing, rather than taking an ideological positions, I allow myself to be led by the facts and figures, which of course I try to gather as objectively and carefully as I can. Sometimes these data and facts lead me to reach a conclusion, but quite often I end up stating only the fact, leaving it to the audience and readers to draw their own conclusion. And I think in the current context, it's also a very safe way of exercising your right of freedom, whatever is left out of it. This also reminds me of Professor Muhammad Mujib, a renowned historian, author of The Indian Muslim, and a long-term vice chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia. I think he served for more than 2 decades as vice chancellor. He was born in an affluent but traditional Muslim family in Lucknow. A religious scholar or a Maulvi Sahab would come to teach him religious studies at home, while for modern education, he was sent to a missionary school. Professor Mujib writes in an autobiographical article that confused about the conflicts in the two systems of education and the two ways of teaching and the two kinds of argument that was told to him, he would often ask questions on what Maulvi Sahab had taught from the teachers, including the Padre in the missionary school, and vice versa. As a result, he would get bashed at both the places. He further states that as he grew up, he became critical of both the ideologies, both the religion, and found his own truth. Such an approach to finding your own truth makes you often lonely, with none of the organized groups coming to your rescue in time of needs. It is therefore quite a risk, and I think Yogendra Yadav alluded to it, to speak on dissent and democracy in the contemporary context. My wise friends and well-wishers, speaking out of their vast experience, often recite a couplet by the famous Urdu poet, humorist, travelogue, and columnist. He was born in undivided Punjab before the partition. His name was Sher Muhammad Khan, but he was more known as Ibn Insha. So they recite his couplet as Haq Acha, पर उसके लिए कोई और मरे तो और अच्छा. तुम भी कोई मंसूर हो जो सूली पे चढ़ो, खामोश रहो, खामोश रहो. Truth is good, but if someone else dies for this truth, that is even better. You are not Mansoor, that you should get hanged and therefore remain mum. Here the reference is to Mansur Hallaj, the 9th century mystic and preacher of Persia, Iran, with huge following till he proclaimed Anal Haq, and Anal Haq meaning I am the truth. This was interpreted as his claim to divinity and as a heresy by the Abbasi rulers of the time. He was arrested, finally executed by hanging after a long period of confinement. This exemplifies the idea, which has so beautifully been alluded to in the concept note that was circulated by Devbrata and was explained with examples by Professor Bhattacharya in his inaugural lecture, rather two Bhattacharyas in his inaugural lecture, and which was theorized by Professor Yogendra Yadav in a myriad of ways. Someone has since made the couplet more explicit, easy to comprehend, and apt to Indian context. Of course, of the 17th century India, by rephrasing it thus, सच के लिए मरना अच्छा, कोई और मरे तो और अच्छा, तुम कोई सरमद हो कि सर कटवाओ, खामोश रहो, खामोश रहो, खामोश रहो. Sarmad, I think many of you must be knowing, was an Armenian-born mystic and a controversial figure of his time. That was 17th century. He came to India and then remained in India till his death. He became part of the imperial court of Dara Shikoh, who submitted himself to his disciple. In fact, Dara Shikoh became his disciple. But soon the War of the Ascension took place, and as Aurangzeb ascended to the imperial throne, he got Sarmad arrested, charging him for heresy, and finally putting him to death by beheading. The difference between the two are of about 800 years. The charge was that Sarmad recited only the first part of Islam's kalima, La ilaha, which meant there is no God, but not the second part of kalima, Illallah, which means except the only God, Allah. Thus, instead of saying there is no God except the only God, Allah, he would say that there is no God. This was taken as a heresy, though Sarmad would insist that he is still struggling to comprehend the first part fully, and unless he overcomes his doubts about this part, how could he move to the latter part of the kalima? Though 800 years apart, Sarmad was referred to as Mansur II of Persia. It is said that during his confinement, he would be brought out in the open to be punished by flogging in public. One day, while he was being taken out for flogging, he came across a thief who, after being punished, was being taken to the jail. The thief stopped and, addressing the mystic, said, "Look, I have been punished several times for the theft that I committed, but I have not given up my profession of thieving, though I know that what I do is punishable by law. You, Sarmad, are being punished for speaking out the truth, which is a right cause. I urge you not to succumb and remain standing up for what you think is right." So I think the message is to people like Professor Yogendra Yadav, who stand up and speak out on behalf of a large majority of the people, not majority in that sense of majoritarian, but majority of the people who want to say something but have become silent to say anything for fear of many different kinds. We are all aware that the history of human civilization and discoveries owe a lot to those who chose to disagree with existing beliefs and sought to look beyond and differently. We are also aware that, barring a few exceptions, dissent throughout the history have never been taken kindly by the dominant powers, imperial or religious. Termed deviant, they were brutally treated, but finally it was the truth that prevailed, and the new ideas and discoveries ultimately gained acceptance in due course of time, with most of them proving to be the turning points that not only opened the new frontiers of knowledge, but also pushed the human civilization to the next higher orbit. But those were the time of the kings and monarchs, which did not necessarily represent people. But who would have thought that the governments of people, by the people, and for the people would one day behave like them and would become so intolerant to deny even fair debate, discussion, discourse, and deliberations on issues of extreme import to people of a nation. There is now only one truth, and that is the truth which is endorsed by the power that be, or what suits to or is convenient to people in power or the dominant power. The edifice of democracy stands erect on the strength of the four pillars, which Yogendra Yadav, of course, referred to, and Professor Kesh, in the introductory lecture, one of the two Bhattacharyas did mention the legislature, executive, judiciary, and the media, with the Constitution providing a series of measures and protections for ensuring that people are able to express themselves freely, live in peace and dignity, right to life and freedom of expression, thought and beliefs are few of them. What I find missing in most of the deliberations so far is the focus on the foundation on which the four pillars of democracy stand. Common sense tells us that pillars gain strength from their foundation. No pillar can bear the weight of an edifice if it stands on a weak foundation. In fact, is stronger and the heavier the columns, resting on a weaker and vulnerable foundation, would crumble faster and soon. Now the question is, what constitutes this foundation? And I have reached to the conclusion, I'm not sure whether everybody would agree to this, that to me this foundation cannot be anything but education. Sadly, we have not done enough to strengthen this foundation over time. In fact, we have over time weakened it knowingly or maybe unknowingly. And let me illustrate with a few examples. As we celebrate the 75th year of our independence, we still have no national system of education. National not in the sense in which the national policy wants us to believe, but in the sense that we do not have a national system of education which ensures, at least up to school level, a reasonably good quality or comparable quality education to children, irrespective of their caste, creed, location, gender, social, and economic backgrounds. Even though the national policy on education of 1986 had promised that the nation would take effective measures in the direction of the common school system, they had in fact reiterated an idea that had been so vociferously emphasized by the Kothari Commission in its report on education and national development in 1968. Acharya Ramamurthy Committee, many of us have forgotten about it, which was constituted to review the national education policy of 86, in its report in 1990 had regarded this common school idea where people of varied social and economic groups, irrespective of their marginalization and deprivation, would study as imminent condition for building a democratic society and as a very vital component of the overall strategy for securing equity and social justice in education and in society. Sadly, however, we allowed ourselves to go on contributing towards the growth of many different kinds and types of schools which segregate people belonging to varying socio-economic groupings. So indifferent have we become by now that we hardly make any qualm about this multiple delivery education system that has divided the populace so much, denying them equality of opportunities. Do we recall today the public report on basic education, probe report in India, as published in 1999, just about a few years ago, which had observed that multiple form of social discrimination operates within the Indian school system. And of course, then it perpetuates in the society. Do we recall today, this varied and multiple delivery system of education provides different varieties of schooling opportunities to different sections of population. There is one type with minimal facilities, in many cases with one teacher or no teacher, or with ill-equipped teacher for the poor and the disadvantaged, while the well-offs go to the elite schools with massive infrastructure. Of course, they are quite often high fee charging institutions in character. And with the passage of time, even this differentiation was not considered enough or adequate, and the rich and the wealthy have been permitted to set up international schooling for their children. What a hierarchical system of education that we have in a democratic nation. And this kind of hierarchy goes on reflecting throughout their productive life, or so long as these people are alive who come out of this system. We are now saddled with the hierarchy of schools comprising elite schools with international certifications, high fee charging private schools for not so rich and middle class, heavily subsidized separate schooling system for the children of the staff of the central government, public undertakings, and the defense establishment, and schools for so-called talented rural children, as if merit was not a social construct. Free education school, both in rural and urban areas, with such poor infrastructure that they are hardly able to provide any education at all, ensuring any career. I had in early 90s undertaken a study of many different types of schools in Delhi. At about the same time, Professor Doraiswamy, who later became Vice Chancellor of the Madras University, undertook a similar study on schools in Chennai. We did not know each other. We had not consulted each other. But just by chance, both of us had resorted to a similar methodology. Interestingly, both of us published a paper based on a study, and these two papers appeared in the same journal in the same issue. And both these studies reached the conclusion that the socio-economic background of the student was the only factor that explained variation in the performance of the government-aided and self-financed private schools. This is some type of counterintuitive, because you think that the private schools provide better education, but in fact, both these studies found that no, it was not the input, it was not the process, but it was the socio-economic background. And as people, poorer section, deprived sections of people migrate from the government schools, stay in the government schools, and the rich and the elite migrate to the private schools, the government schooling suffers on account of people who belong to the poorer background. This simply meant also that education of elite is no problem at all. Wherever they go, whatever they study, they are likely to do better in not only in education, but also later in their life, because they have the strength of the social endowment and the family and network support that enables them to rise high. And therefore, the real challenge is thus the education of the masses, children of the weaker and the marginalized sections and the other deprived social group. No wonder that M. Venner, in his treatise on Child and the State in India, published by Oxford University Press in 1991, reached the conclusion that education in India itself was an instrument for differentiation by separating children according to social class. Mind you, I'm not digressing from the topic. Later on, I'll try to link it to its impact on our ability to dissent. At about the same time, Mr. Anand Swarup and Mr. Madan Mohan Jha were working on reviving the common school system in India. And at that time, Mr. Ashok Agrawal, presently known for his, a lawyer and presently known for his activism for the children's right and the parents' right in school, had painfully pointed out that the existing system of education seems to have been adversely affecting the quality of the governance in the country. He further stated that it is sowing the seed of superiority, hierarchy, and insensitivity against the people, the poor in particular, at a very early age in their life, which gets reflected very strongly in the governance at each level, not only of the school, but of the state and the national level. He had further pointed out that the system reinforces compulsions, comparisons, and competitions that restricts options, individuality, and cooperation. Sadly, the phenomena has only deepened over the past 3 decades since. A process that had begun in late 50s in the school sector and where it reached its crescendo by mid-80s was set in motion in the higher education sector in late 80s and is already manifesting trends similar to the school sector. Higher educational institutions in India today are all the more heterogeneous in terms of kinds, types, and categories. Each of these different types, subtypes, categories, and subcategories of the institutions differ significantly in terms of their approach, orientation, curricula, pedagogy, funding, regulation, size, and of course, with implications on equity and inclusivity, and also the quality of education. Considering that higher education sector in the country is expected to achieve 3 major objectives of expansion, equity, and excellence, such an extreme heterogeneity is bound to have serious consequences and implications. Arguably, variety in the educational institutions and the quality of education that they impart also impact on access to opportunities post-education, economic or otherwise, later in the life of these graduates. Now think of this and link it to what Professor Yogendra Yadav was referring to as street players, street actors, which troll you for saying anything that does not appeal to them, that does not suit to them, that is not convenient to them. It means over time we have produced people in such a divergent manner that they are unable to comprehend the other's point of view. They have been so segregated. And so has been the case of the teachers as well. Slightly digressing, and I'm reaching towards the end to save time. Say, for example, due to inequitable access to opportunities, in a country of 130 crore people, if only 30 crore people are employed in the formal sector, and the rest are in the informal and the non-formal sector living hand-to-mouth existence, a little job security and the income security that these people have is only for those which work in the formal sector. Any discussion and debate on the loss of income during pandemic, post-pandemic, demonetization, lockdown effects would invite you a wide variety of views because the rest of the populace had never enjoyed or experienced the luxury which these 13 crore people in the country were enjoying. And these are the kind of differences on which the power that be plays on. Such heterogeneous and divided populace make it very, very convenient for the mighty and powerful, particularly when they are in power, in creating many alternative narratives and counter dissents to any discussions that does not suits to them. I think I'll stop here with the only words that it's already too late. And we need to focus on an education system so that we produce people who do not see education only as an instrument to economic gains, but which enlightens them, which allows them not to be led by people. And unless we do that, our system, the democratic system, would keep on throwing up leaders and their supporters of the kind that we are faced with today. Thank you very much, Debrat, for giving me this opportunity. Once again, thank you.